We made this.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and I am joined today by a new guest, and that is Chris Andersen. Chris, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. I was glad to get your email, and it came in just at the right time because we had someone pull out at the last minute when we were scheduling for this season, and I had just emailed you and said, like, well, if something happens, then, you know, I'll let you know if we can bring you in this season. Otherwise, we'll get you in this next season, and fortunately, it all worked out. We were able to get you on this season, and glad we were able to finally work it out after some email tag back and forth.
Yeah. You know, it complicated modern life, right? But hey, you gotta make time to make your art. So I'm glad to be here.
Exactly, yeah. So before we get started too much about the movie for today, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, first off, I would be remiss if I did not mention my own podcast. If you listen to me talking today and decide, hey, I want to listen to that guy some more, you should check out Uncle Monster's Spooky Time Fright Hour, a comedy podcast about monsters. Every week we talk about a new monster. Me and my co-host switch off researching monsters. For fans of Japanese culture, we just did one about the Gasha Dokuro and giant skeleton. And, you know, it's a fun stuff. My history with movies, I studied film at NYU back around the turn of the millennium. And after that, I worked at Kim's Video, New York City's foremost video store. I worked there for about a decade, you know, so I watched probably about 4 movies a day, 20 movies a week for about 10 years. So I've got my movie watching under my belt.
Very cool. So about that podcast, just a few questions that came up here and you talk about it. So when you say you spotlight a different monster and you do research of it, do you mostly focus on stuff from like mythology, or do you also touch on like, you know, media monsters as well, things that are like more recent, that kind of stuff? Like what's kind of your approach for them?
We do a little bit of both. We started off largely on the cryptid beat, but then we found ourselves sort of getting lumped in with like Sasquatch hunter style shows and like ghost guys. And like, we're not doing that. We're just goofing around and having fun. So we talk a little bit about all types. You know, we did Chupacabra for your bigger stuff, but we also did Spring-Heeled Jack, the British gentleman ghost. We did the Baku, the dream-eating tapir from Japan. We did an episode about Paul Bunyan. We sort of just jump all over the place. We're very loose in the format.
Okay, cool. And how long have you guys been doing that?
We started that as a Pando project, like so many podcasts. And right now we are going to be getting close to 100 episodes. We're on season 5, and we do about 17 episodes a season.
Very cool. Yeah, we're close. We started before this started, actually before the pandemic, and then we had we doing the season format. So we are just shy of 100 episodes on this show as well. I don't think we're hitting it this season, but I think maybe next season we'll be hitting 100.
Oh, all right. We'll race to the century mark. See who gets there first.
Go. Yeah. So talking a little bit more about your background in film, what kind of led you to studying film in the first place?
Well, I started off doing like a lot of theatrical comedy, you know, like when I was a kid. I was a drama kid, and I actually did like sketch comedy as a 12-year-old with my podcast co-host. We go back that far. And so from there, from theater, I grew more interested in film throughout high school. And, you know, when you're 17, you're thinking, yeah, obviously all I need to do is go to college and get a degree, and then somebody will hire me as a director. Boom, I've got it. And
it doesn't quite work that way.
That was my progression. Yeah, you really thought that there was like a movie factory and you just go down
Mhm.
and show them your diploma and they're like, perfect, you're going to direct Scream 7.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Unfortunately, does not work that way.
No,
Um,
no.
which is why I ended up doing teaching as well, because I had that feeling that would not work out as I'd hoped.
Yeah,
Um, oh, go
I
ahead.
just the the idea of the constant freelance life of a film professional just always struck me as such a nightmare once I realized that was what it was going to actually have to be to just sell yourself nonstop for the rest of your
Mm,
life sounded like such a nightmare. So I
yeah.
ended up taking a desk job at the post office where I'm very happy.
Yeah. So specifically about Japanese films now, what was kind of
Mhm.
your history with Japanese movies?
Well, I think like a lot of people my age, I my inroad was early anime, like the early stuff that crossed over across the Pacific. You know, probably stuff like Sailor Moon and Robotech
Hmm.
was a big one for me, and from there blossoming out into a larger culture. And obviously, my time that I was at Kim's Video, you know, you get to watch so many movies, and our selection was so famously broad. I think we had 15,000 DVDs by the time we
Hmm.
closed, that you sort of, after year 5, you sort of watched every movie that you ever wanted to watch at that point. And so the
Right.
next 5 years, you're just like, well, what looks interesting? What looks weird? And
Hmm.
getting any was definitely something that looked weird, which is how I ended up there.
Yeah, very cool. And also that time period. I think you said you were working there in the late '90s, early 2000s, right?
Yeah, I started in 99 and I
Hmm.
left when my branch closed at around 2009.
Yeah, and that was kind of like peak time for fans of like weird Japanese cinema, because so much of that
Mm,
stuff was making its way across the pond back then. Horror as well, like that was kind of like the catalyst for it. And then you had like stuff like Ringu, and then from there led to stuff like the Ju-on and Takashi Miike stuff was coming
mhm.
over very big at that point. Um, and that kind of really fueled this. I remember back then there was like all these DVD distributors that were just, buying up the rights to every
Mhm.
weird Asian movie they could find and releasing it in the West, like Tartan and Arrow and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there was a huge market for them. There was such a DVD explosion, and I
Hmm.
think people were waiting for something like that to happen with Blu-ray. And for a wide number of reasons, it never had that same sort of cinephile explosion that DVD
Right.
did. Where just
Yeah.
like anybody who bought a DVD player all of a sudden became a cinephile and could buy
Exactly.
a bunch of DVDs.
Yeah, I think there were so many of us back then who were just going to, because they flooded the market with so many DVDs, and they're so easy to make. So there's so much of that stuff ended up in used DVD stores. I remember like I got my first DVD player probably like 99 or 2000, and by the time I was in
Mhm.
university, which was like fall of 2002, there were already used DVD stores that were like filled to the shelves with used
Yeah,
movies to buy dirt cheap.
Yeah, especially once they started getting into the game of re-releasing them into more and
Hmm.
more deluxe editions. Everybody buying Evil Dead 2 for the 5th time. You
Yes,
know,
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
they did sort of end up cannibalizing their own market eventually.
Mhm. And also, I think Netflix also helped a lot with that, with when they had the DVD market, because everybody was all these distributors were putting out their stuff. You could rent them easily on Netflix for, it was like what,
Mhm.
like $5 a month, and you could have unlimited DVD rentals. And so I think all that also really helped fuel that kind of explosion too.
Yeah, yeah. I could go on for ages and ages about the final act of video stores and their death knell. Uh, it's an interesting story that I think is yet to be definitively told.
Yeah, and it's an interesting story too, because they still exist in some place. Like we still have DVD rental shops here in Japan. They're slowly dropping, but a lot
Hmm.
of them have been moving into web distribution as well, where they're putting out like the old Netflix model, where you can rent
Mhm.
DVDs through them. So it looks like at least here they're trying to keep it going, which is, I think it's cool, because it's, the as easy as streaming is, the rights issues with a lot of these movies make it difficult to keep a lot of those movies available. Whereas with DVDs, once you buy the disc, you can rent it out as many times you want. As long as
Mhm.
that disc is still intact, they don't have to worry about taking it out of circulation.
Yeah, that was one problem with DVDs, is they were slightly less robust than
Mhm.
VHS. They were pretty much always getting scratched up, or people were always returning the DVD case without the DVD inside, which is a
Yeah.
lot harder to do with a VHS tape. But to look back on video stores as something that was almost a generational phenomenon. Like at
Mhm.
the time, it never occurred to me that they would be our like sock hop or malt shop, something that
Right.
was so like emblematic of a specific time that came and went. They seemed like video stores would be around forever, and they feel like they did offer a lot to cinephiles who could enjoy them. You know that the owners could curate a collection that reflected their community or their particular interests. And your average, like, Netflix has something like 4,000 movies, but nobody wants to watch 3,000 of them at best. Do you know what I mean? Like, the selection for streaming compared to a decent video store is such a joke. With the
Absolutely.
possible
Yeah.
exception of Tubi. Tubi is fantastic.
Yeah, and I still go to the video stores here now, and one of the nice things about them is there is kind of that feel of discovery that you used to have, which the
Mhm.
Netflix algorithms just doesn't quite match as much the same way. And so you see some random DVD case on the wall, and you're like, oh, what's this? This is interesting. Whereas I mean, I hate the Netflix algorithm for so many reasons, but one of the reasons
Mhm.
is that it limits, it doesn't let me see everything they have. I just want to look at what the whole collection is, and they won't let me see it.
Yeah, pretty much any streaming service that I have now, the first thing I do whenever I sign up for a new one or just whenever I'm bored, I'll just go straight to the complete A to Z
Hmm.
listing of what they
That's what
have
I
and just
yeah, that's what I
because
like about like
Netflix has
Hulu
weird
and
stuff.
yeah, Hulu and Disney Plus. That's what I like about them, is that they let you view the whole collections. Like, you want to see all the action movies we have, here's the entire list. I'm like, okay, great. All of this alphabetized. I could just scroll through and see what's interesting. But Netflix, they used to have that option, now they don't anymore, which drives me insane, because I've had stuff on this show where I'm like, people request some movie I've never heard of. I'm like, oh, let me see if that's in the video store, because I've never seen it pop up on Netflix. And then I do a quick search on Netflix for it. I'm like, oh, it's right there, and Netflix has never shown it to me.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember when the early days of Netflix setting up, they were trying to find like they were offering like $1 million prize to generate a better algorithm,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And none of it was as good as a seasoned video store clerk saying, "What was the last movie you saw that you liked? Do you want a movie
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
similar to that, or do you want a movie that's different from that?" That
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
always my go-to, and it always worked.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Getting Any, the movie we're talking about today. This is directed by Takeshi Kitano.
Mhm.
And the Japanese title is Mina Yateruka, which literally is everyone doing it. Yaru being like, it's like a colloquial form of having sex, like doing it, basically, is what it
Got it.
literally translates to.
It's
Um,
everybody doing the nasty.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's not specifically saying sex. It's just like, the English equivalent of are you doing it? Are you get so Getting Any
Yeah.
is a pretty good translation of that. And this came out in 1995. Written, directed, and edited, and Kitano also has a part in it as well.
Mhm.
And actually, this is the movie that he said, like, this, of all the movies he made, this is one he had the most fun making.
And
And
you
you can
can
kind of see
tell it's
why.
a
Yeah.
very fun movie.
Yeah. So,
And
sorry, go ahead.
and it's so different to think of him in this film compared to the rest of his filmography, where he does so many like gangster movies, like Hanabi or Sonatine, and but he grew up or came up in the arts doing stand-up comedy, or the Japanese cultural equivalent of stand-up comedy. I forget the specific name of the style of comedy.
Yeah, there are a few different variations of it. But basically, he came up in the comedy scene. Like, his comedy stage name, Beat Takeshi, is what most people still know him as in
Mm.
Japan. And even though he's gotten a lot more acclaim as director in the West, I think most people in the West know him more from like his directing, or his performances in like Yakuza films or stuff like Battle Royale, where he plays like
Mhm.
these much harder characters. But a lot of people in Japan, they still have the image of him more as a comedian type, as opposed to the more of the serious actor type.
Yeah, I think the best equivalent that I heard the best comparison somebody made to me was that he's sort of like Robin Williams if you only knew him for like the last 10 years of his career.
I was gonna that's the exact name that I was going to. Yeah, very very similar kind of idea. Whereas uh big difference is Williams never branched out into directing, but yeah, in terms of the comedic versus dramatic, very very similar career paths where they both kind of came up in comedy and then they branched out into the more serious stuff. So you said you discovered this while you were working at the store. So what about this movie made you want to watch it?
Well, Kitano was one of those guys that I had heard of, for a long time, and someone who I had sort of a passing interest in, but I never really checked out too much of his work because, basically, because you get sort of paralyzed by choice when you have all those movies for you, and it can be hard to overcome that inertia and check something out new sometimes. But then and back then, a lot of the Katana movies that were coming out on DVD were coming out on like these Tarantino imprints. The Weinstein Company to keep Tarantino busy or keep him happy, or who knows who decided how. But he ended up partnering with the Weinsteins to distribute a lot of foreign films. I think he did Chungking Express was probably the biggest one they did. A lot of stuff out of Hong Kong. But he also put out a couple of Kitano movies that really helped him make inroads into the States. And that was most of what we had. But then eventually we got in this Chinese bootleg, maybe not a bootleg, but a region-free Chinese DVD, probably gray market.
Yeah, probably Hong Kong or something like that. That's where a lot of them came from back then.
Yeah, and like the cover was like just like this very crude collage of different characters in the film, and you just saw the title "Getting Any" next to this giant fly monster and Kitano with this goofy bowl haircut, and the back just being just something vaguely implying that it was a sex comedy. And I was like, that sounds great. You never see foreign sex comedies crossing over to the States, and it's the kind of thing where like every national cinema has to be producing sex comedies, but they almost never they're not the films that get brought over, and for a lot of reasons.
Well, yeah, I mean that's one of the things. I've seen a few Japanese comedies, and the one of the problems is that they are so they're so specific to the Japanese style of comedy. Like Japanese comedy tends to be very slapsticky. It's not as even like the whole concept of sarcasm, which is what a lot of American comedies tend to lean towards. It doesn't really exist here. There's not really a Japanese word for sarcasm. Anytime I try to explain sarcasm to my Japanese students, it's really difficult because it's just something that they don't really have any real kind of cultural equivalent to. And so it's really difficult to try and say like, oh, well, this is sarcasm or this is satire. And it's kind of like, what do those things mean? It's like that old, that old Supreme Court justice said like about pornography. He's like, I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it. That's kind of how I feel like trying to describe satire or sarcasm to Japanese students. And what you said about the Tarantino stuff, my understanding of that was that back in the day, like Tarantino was trying to get a lot of these films released in the West, and like the Weinsteins or anyone else, their whole deal with Tarantino was, we will release this, but only if we can put your name on it as a selling point. And even like something
definitely like Quentin Tarantino presents.
Yes, exactly.
Real big front.
And I think like Sonatine, actually, for going back to another Kitano film, as I recall, I actually got my copy of Sonatine because it came packaged with another Tarantino movie. It was like a bonus disc on like, I can't even remember what the DVD was, but one like reissue of a Tarantino movie or something had Sonatine in there as a bonus disc.
Okay. I mean, hey, God bless. I'm sure at least Kitano got some money for it, and a couple more people watch Sonatine. It's not the worst way to get a movie out there.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. I mean, whatever ways you can get these out there, that's that's great, especially because, if not for people like Tarantino or Robert Rodriguez or any of these other people who were kind of championing these movies, they would not have gotten releases at all. So like I'm obviously very familiar with Kitano from a lot of his other stuff, but I'd never even seen this movie. I'd never even heard of this movie. So this was completely off my radar when you mentioned it to me.
So
But
what
what
did you
was
think? Give me your big picture.
I liked it. I thought it was really
Good.
funny. I think there's a definite shift though. Like I definitely have more of a preference for the first half when it's
Yeah.
and when it gets in the second half and it gets in kind of the movie parody stuff. I mean, it's still good, but it doesn't match kind of like the laugh height peaks that we got in the first half of it.
Yeah, the first half is just so like straightforward. It's just gag after gag. It's almost like a series of comic strips.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like if you've ever read any old like Charles Schultz Peanuts, he
Mm-hmm.
would he would get a theme and he would just do variations on a theme for like a week. It would just be like, oh, Charlie Brown's into cowboys this week. So every day I'm just going to do a different thing where Charlie Brown is on a cowboy and it'd be just a slight variation on the same sort of gag of like, oh, isn't it goofy that Charlie Brown is a cowboy? And this,
Mm-hmm.
it's spending the first half hour of just like, what if an idiot was trying to rob a bank? And
Yeah.
just gags about a guy walking into a bank, what could happen? And they were just so tight. And it was just laugh after laugh. And once you get into the second half, which is more of like, I'd say once you hit the gangster section,
Mm-hmm.
it loses its center line a little bit. You start spending more time with characters other than your main character, and it suffers a little bit for it. But I still think there's a lot of solid gags in the second half for sure.
Yeah, there are. And you know what's funny? Kitano has denied that this is supposed to be a satire of Japanese society, which I'm not sure I really completely believe him on this because I think maybe if he was doing it unintentionally, but it seems like there's a lot of intentional satire happening here.
Yeah, I think there might be individual elements of satire. I think what he was scared of is people reading it as like a larger allegory, where
Mm-hmm.
people were like, is the huge pile of human feces at the end, does that represent capitalism? And he was like, no, it's a huge pile of feces because I think that's funny.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what he said was his whole goal behind this movie was he just kind of wanted to, he just wanted to make the audience laugh and just kind of like wanted to laugh at his own gags. Like he just kind of wanted to make stuff that he thought was he personally thought was funny. And I think that definitely comes very much into the play in the second half more than the first half because the second half it like you said it kind of loses it the story basically goes out the window in the second half completely.
Yeah, as
it
much of a story as there is. This
right,
is not a plot-driven film.
No, not at all. This is like, it's very much, I mean, this could have easily been like a sketch comedy where like every single instance, you don't even have to have the same actor in each one of these little vignettes and it would have made perfect sense. But the basic idea behind this is you've got this character named Asao who's like this, he's like this guy in his mid 30s, and he is obsessed with sex, but he has no experience talking with girls. So it opens on with him like there's this porno that he's watching, and this suave guy picks up this girl along a street and offers, and he's driving like a convertible, and he offers her a ride, and like just like right after he picks her up, he says, "How would you like to have car sex?" And and then they pull over and they have car sex, and then his takeaway from that is like, "I need a car to go have sex," and his interactions with this car dealer is. I think probably personally, I think it's the funniest part of this, because
it starts off really strong by starting off with that car dealer sequence.
Yeah, because he goes to the car dealer and, he says to the car dealer, he's like, "Oh, I want to buy a car." And the dealer says, "Well, what kind of car do you want?" He's like, "Whatever car I can have sex in." And the dealer's just kind of like, "Okay, I got something for you."
Yeah. And I think the reason why this movie works, I think for an international audience, I think better than a lot of other comedies, is that it doesn't rely nearly as much on things like wordplay. It doesn't rely so much on a lot of cultural specificity. Like it doesn't. The way that he's saying it doesn't necessarily a satire. You don't need to have an intimate familiarity with Japanese culture in order to understand the humor here. All you need to understand is that when people are horny, they get stupid.
Yes.
And everybody can laugh at that.
And there is a lot of, I think, with this whole idea of, confusing porn with real life, which is something that has been talked about a lot. In a way, it's kind of prophetic because that's actually been something that's been a big driver about a lot of the social anxieties that a lot of young men feel, especially in Japan. Is this kind of this idea of like, porn is not real life. And that is made abundantly clear to Asao whenever he goes out in this car, like, which is the first car he gets. He tells the guy he's got like no money, so he gives him this really crap K car, which is like this kind of like small energy efficient car, and he tries driving up to random women and asking if they want to have sex, and it's just, and he gets obviously he gets turned down every single time.
And what's funny is that first sequence where he's driving up to these women in his sequence of shitty cars, because he gets a couple more duds. But that's the only time in the film where you see him interact with any women and like try and like talk to them to have sex with them. After that, his plans get more and more abstract, and sex becomes just sort of a MacGuffin for him to just like, oh, now I'm going to try and rob a bank so I can get money so I can go on a plane, because people will have sex with you on a plane. Or I'm going to try and become a movie star because people want to have sex with movie stars. Or I'm going to become a gangster for no clear reason.
Well, I mean, when he finally does get a car, it's because he steals this car that the brakes are busted on, and then he sees this this woman walking down the road, and he ends up running her over because he can't stop the damn car. But also he's got this idea, again, this other idea coming from porn with the whole cabin attendant subgenre, which is huge, very popular subgenre here in Japan. Okay. And he's got this idea of like, well, if I get a first class plane ticket, the stewardesses always have sex with the customers in first class. But first I need to get a gun. I need to have money. So to get money, I need to rob a bank. But to rob a bank, I need a gun. To get a gun, I'm going to take a job in this foundry to make my own gun.
Yeah, where there is a random group of Iranian people who say they want to eat whale meat, which I thought was such a great little one-off gag.
Also, there's the when he's with the car dealership, the little kid who keeps messing around with all the cars, and like routinely the car dealer just goes over to the kid and just whacks him on the head.
Yeah, and each whack will be a different sound effect.
Yeah,
which is such a weird little gag. And there's so many gags here that I feel like are so specific to film, and the timing of it is so like, there's so much funny editing in this movie.
Yeah,
like every scene sort of starts, every scene tends to be a self-contained gag, especially in this front half. And every scene starts as late as possible and ends as soon as the gag hits. Like, there are all these scenes of him trying to rob a bank, but there's never a scene of him being outside, be like, I got to get in this bank because I need this money so that I can do this. It didn't go well last time, but this time I'm feeling great. It's always just him walking into the bank.
Yeah.
And then all the customers and all the employees at the bank, they're all uniformed police officers. And he turns around and walks out. And it's just like simple sight gags that hit every time.
Well, also too, the bank employees, right? He comes in there and he's like, I'm here to steal all the money. He's like, okay, yeah, please just wait a second. Like a clear commentary on like the insane rigiditude of Japanese bureaucracy, to the point where even someone who comes in with an art to rob the bank has to take a number.
Yeah, or when he tries to cat burgle the bank, and so he goes up the back stairs all the way to the top, and first he throws a rope over the side, but he forgot to tie the rope to anything, so the rope just all falls to the ground. So he goes back down and he gets a rope, and he walks back up the fire escape, and this time he ties it off, and he goes down the rope, and he just lands on the sidewalk in front of the bank. It's just these simple gags that just are so fun to watch. It's really inventive. And like another thing that'll do is he'll cue you in to the new start of every set piece by just holding on a character's face for like slightly longer than you expect. Just to sort of set the scene. He's so good at setting these little sequences up and like giving you this rhythm.
Another thing I thought was interesting too is just that Asao has no money, is kind of like the gag, and yet somehow he finds the way to fund all these ludicrous plans. Like somehow he finds a way to get police uniforms and all this kind of stuff without any problem.
Yeah, and surely at some point when he was involved with the gangsters, he could have got himself a nice car. But by that point, you're already on to the next thing. Like, you can't examine it. You just have to keep on moving.
Yeah. And then when he finally does decide to, he does end up getting on a plane, but he thinks it's like, oh, well, I can't get on a 747, maybe on a Cessna. So he goes to an airfield and he finds a Cessna. He asks them about, is there going to be a show or anything like that? And he's on this Cessna with one other passenger, and the show ends up being the male pilot doing kind of like this strip show for them, and then just jumping out of the plane and popping back in a moment later.
Yeah, he appears to leap out of the side of the plane, and then the two of them start fighting. Asao and the other passenger are fighting over this parachute, and one guy gets shoved out of the plane, and then the pilot just shows up. See, this is one of the reasons why I think comedies don't travel internationally as often, is that it's very hard to say anything intelligent about a comedy. You just end up sort of being like, it was really funny. This part was funny. Did you see that? That was funny. You don't sound cool, but so sorry, listeners.
It's funny. A lot of this, have you ever seen the movie Tampopo?
Yes.
The way that this is kind of structured, it did remind me a lot of Tampopo in that way, because Tampopo has that kind of thing too, where it's got this main story, whereas I think the story in Tampopo is more prevalent throughout, and it has a more consistent through line. But it does have these little gags that come in and out that aren't really connected to the main narrative. They're just there to kind of, poke fun at Japanese society. It feels like
they're sort of thematically related.
Right. It feels like Kitano is doing something similar here, where the driving force behind these little sketches, as much as he says it's just, I wanted gags that would make me laugh, it does seem like there are some comments he's making about Japanese society in each one of these little segments. I mean, like, for example, the hostess who comes into the car dealership that he uses to demonstrate how he can have car sex in this one car. It's just kind of like, it's kind of like the ridiculous extremes of Japanese hospitality there.
Yeah. I think there are moments of satire for sure. And I think in terms structurally, I was trying to think of the movie, because you could say it has a lot in common with something like Kentucky Fried Movie or Airplane. But I think Airplane is definitely much more plot driven than this is.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I would say structurally the movie reminds me most of is Freddy Got Fingered, where
I've actually never seen that. So,
well, Tom Green plays an animator who wants to become a professional animator and move out of his parents' house. But nothing that he really does would actually clearly get him to that goal. He's just sort of doing things and ostensibly saying it's towards this goal. It's just the lightest sort of clothesline that you can hang your movie on. And it's all you need as long as the gags keep hitting.
Yeah. And then with the Cessna scene, after that, he takes it turns out this other passenger who he accidentally, I think he kind of like breaks his neck or something by accident when he's wrestling with him or strangles him. But then what he does is he realizes this guy's got a pretty nice suit. So he takes it. And then when he gets off the plane, he gets approached by the Yakuza. And this is where we start getting it. This seems like the big transition into the more film parody type of thing. So we've got this whole satire of, sorry, go ahead.
We skipped an entire satirical section, which was his take on filmmaking. We skipped the Zatoichi movie section.
That's right. Yes, I did forget about that. You're right. Yes, so that's actually where it starts, with where he has this he gets this Zatoichi type. He does play Zatoichi basically. And what's funny about that too is Kitano himself would later go on to direct and star in a Zatoichi movie himself.
Yeah, you could see he was probably working out how we'd want to do it.
Yeah,
probably not that closely. I'm sure the final Zatoichi did not resemble too much the Zatoichi in Getting Any.
No, definitely not. No, but there was some comedic elements in it. So there is a bit of comedy elements in that movie. It's a fun film. If you haven't seen that, you should definitely check that out. But also when he joins the Yakuza, the guy he killed and inadvertently takes the identity of is Joe Shishido, who I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it wasn't actually the name of an actor who was very big in Yakuza films back in like through like the 50s to the 70s.
Yeah, did he do like Battles with Honor and Humanity, that one?
He
The
did.
second
I think
one?
he was in one of the later ones, but he wasn't in the first one.
Okay.
But he did do like Branded to Kill. He did also. We covered another one this season actually, which was A Cult Is My Passport. He
Mm.
was in the last. He was final episode was the Battles Without Honor and Humanity. He was in.
Oh, okay.
Cruel Gun Story was another one he was in. Rusty Knife. He had done a lot of these. He did 300 some movies in his lifetime, and a bunch of TV shows as well. And he was kind
Oh,
of
God
known,
bless.
yeah. And he had he was also known by the nickname Joe the Ace because he was in this Quick Draw Joe was a Western movie he did. Famously very famous for his artificial cheekbones that he had surgically
Ah,
altered, which kind of made him look like which I think kind of made him look like a chipmunk, which he talked about
well,
in the last
hey,
movie.
it clearly worked for him if he got into 300 films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. But so him taking on that name and the hitman being Joe Shishido, that was obviously it's not a name that you pick out that you accidentally stumble on, right? That was a clear
Yeah,
reference.
no, that was a choice. Yeah. And I think at this point we introduce these other sort of gangster characters, and I think the head gangster Akaiwa, played by Tetsuya Yuki, if I'm saying that correctly, he was like, at this point almost everyone in the film is very flat. They're very sort of dry. It's a very wry film, despite these sort of over the top visual gags and subject matter. But then you have this sort of very stylized, very manic Yakuza leader who's yelling at him and bossing him around and being amazed at what a wonderful gunman he is. And I think I understand why Kitano brought that in, because you want to change that energy maybe a little bit. You don't want to have it be sort of one note throughout your entire film. It might be tough to sustain that. So I understand why he brought him in. And I do think that this segment is stronger than the final scientist segment. But it is a distinct shift in tone from the first half of the film.
Yeah. This is when they kind of go full on into the film parody stuff. And you've got these the Yakuza sequence is fun. It's a little bit drawn out, but it does have some great moments in it. Like when he and here's the funny thing, like when he's in that situation, when he's at that party, this is like the best time when he could get laid, and it just and it never he never even thinks to ask about any of that. And in that sequence, like it's the Yakuza, the boss himself is the one who's doing kind of like the strip show dance.
Yeah. And I wrote down my favorite gag from the Yakuza sequences. At one point, he's tasked with assassinating a rival Yakuza boss.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's going to bring him a birthday cake with a bomb in it. And a failed businessman finds a birthday cake, and he brings it home, and he tells his family, hey, don't worry, things are looking up. I've got this great birthday cake. Let's all do this birthday cake dance that we always do. And him and his family are dancing around the table. Cake it, yo. Cake it, yo. And then the cake explodes. It's just like, it sets it up as just these completely innocent, sad people getting destroyed by Yakuza incompetence.
Well, see, one of the funny things about it, because I wrote down in my notes, like, these bombs are pretty ineffective because he blows himself up with one of them, and all it is just like he's scorched black and his hair is singed. And it's the same thing with the family. Like, nobody actually dies from these bombs. So
they're classic, like Acme level bombs. They're Looney Tunes bombs.
And like, it's not that the businessman finds the cake; it's that Asao gives it to him. He's like, could you bring this cake over to the boss over there? And the guy's like, well, why can't you do it yourself? And he's like, I'm shy. And he's like, okay, well, I'll do it then. And then he just he looks around the corner, and then he steals the cake and runs home with and also when he's when they've got that spy and they're torturing him, and the boss says to him, show him our hospitality, right? And then what they do is they take it literally, and they have him at dinner with like these hostess girls and everything. He's like, I didn't mean it like that.
Yeah. Just simple gags that are just executed so well.
Right, and going back to Airplane, it does remind me of the whole drinking problem thing, where literally he
Yeah.
cannot drink a glass of water.
And it I guess that would be an example of wordplay that does work internationally. That hospitality does have that sort of, you could almost say that he was saying hospitality sarcastically.
Yeah,
That might be a decent example to show that to your students.
It also could be a comment on the fact that Japanese people don't understand satire. So
yeah, maybe. Yeah, all of you guys are like the dumb gangsters that are being nice to this guy.
And then we also get with the scientists, which the head scientist is played by Kitano with, like you mentioned, this really weird bowl cut wig he's wearing.
Yeah, it's so funny.
And you've got this, and then they manage to turn him invisible, and then they have to try and hunt him down. And so it's this weird Ghostbusters parody that's going on in there throughout the entire thing, even with like a riff of the Ghostbusters. Yeah, it's like Ghostbusters riff on the theme song too.
And also previously, when they had the two Yakuza showing down, there was also a Beat It parody song on.
That's right, yeah.
Which, once again, just a note or two off enough so that you don't need to worry about the rights. Everything's nice and legal.
And also
Beat It is also a reference to Kitano's stage name.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even consider that, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Maybe that's a stretch, but I mean, it could work.
I could definitely see. I mean, like Michael Jackson's very popular here, so I could see it. I could see the reason why he chose to throw that one in instead of something else.
And it is interesting to think about this being in 1995. Both of those references being from things from the 80s, a little bit more dated, crossing the pond, but probably had better cultural saturation in Japan at that point if you're going to be referencing American stuff.
I think so too. Yeah. Well, also the lots of references to 80s films in this. You also have the whole sequence of him turning into a fly, right? That's straight out of David Cronenberg's film, but also the Invisible Man and the Fly Man, according to Wikipedia, that might have been based on a 1957 Japanese horror movie called Transparent Man and Fly Man.
Oh, okay. That would be an interesting one to track down.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if they'd be available anywhere, but
probably that might be one lost at the time.
And then it ends with kind of like this Godzilla homage because he turns into this giant fly. So they decide, and you've got like the World Defense Force, which is straight out of like the later Showa era Godzilla films. And you've got the reference to Mothra with these fly girls, which
yeah, always good to see a couple fly girls in your movie. But they also have like hula dancers. They're just trying everything to get his attention. They do end up making a giant tub with a human feces from all across Japan to lure him in. And also at one point, right before they merge him into a fly, they're showing like a bunch of computer stuff on it. It has a bunch of broken English on it, which is always fun for a native English speaker to see a bunch of broken English. But I also noticed they listed as Asao's blood type as B+. And if I knew anything about Japanese blood type fortune telling, I can tell you what that means.
So what is, I don't know what that means in, I know that the blood type thing is still something that's, very culturally big here in Japan, but I don't know the meanings of them. So what's the meaning of B+?
I have no idea. I was just hoping you'd have that one in your pocket.
No, sorry, I don't.
Listeners, write in if you know what B+ blood type dudes are like.
And then they get this giant tub of shit, and it's, well, one of the things is that the B+ is it's very rare apparently, so that's one thing about it. So what it is that individuals who have B personality type, it's that they make their decisions very quickly. They're not good at taking orders, and when they focus on something, they put their all into it. And I think if it's a plus, then it's they're more of that quality. Where if it's a minus, they're less of that quality. So I think how the logic goes with that. I mean,
that sounds like a Sao to a T.
Definitely describes a Sao, yeah. But I think it's complete. I mean, obviously complete pseudoscience, but it's something that's still.
But if it's there like, as a signifier of this character, if it's something that was put there to communicate something to the audience, I think it makes sense.
No, absolutely, yeah. And even though it's and it's kind of like, even though they do have the Chinese zodiac here in Japan, the blood
Mhm.
type is, I think, something that they rely on a little bit more for, but as like a zodiac equivalent in the West.
Makes sense.
And so then they get this giant tub of shit, and that's how they lure him. And then eventually they bring him down with the fly swatter. And
Mhm.
then there's a credit sequence with an alternate ending where he is, instead of a fly, he's kind of like a giant grasshopper. It looked like, and
Yeah.
he ends up getting impaled on Tokyo Tower.
Yeah, also a good gag. And I think his last words as a fly were car sex, which
That's
I
right.
think is a
Yes.
great way to tie it back to the beginning of the film. Like, oh wait, yeah, this guy did all this because he was horny.
Yeah.
It's it's crazy what you'll find yourself doing if you lose
Well,
your head.
I mean, it's so funny because he goes to all these lengths to have sex, and it's just like the simplest thing would have been, dude, if you had just taken the money you stole, you could have easily just gotten a prostitute.
Yeah, yeah. Once again, Asao, not a thinker, not going through that. I think even towards the beginning of the movie, he got some money by selling his grandfather's organs
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
order to get that Cessna plane ticket, I think.
No, that was so that he could buy another car. So he gets
The
uh
convertible that collapses?
the Miata, yeah. And he says he's like, "Oh, this is the better car." And uh but then it completely falls apart because that money that he got from cashing in his grandfather's liver and kidneys was not enough to afford the Austin Healey, which he was trying to get. And yeah, like, dude, you could have just taken that money and just could have gone to a soap land or something, and you wouldn't have to worry about all this.
Yeah, yeah. But when you get horny and you get stupid, you don't make
Mm.
good decisions. And I think that is the universal appeal of getting it.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing that Kitano was making fun of was the young Japanese men at the time who were much too direct and simplistic when it came to talking with girls about sex. And
Mhm.
and so that's another thing he said that he was kind of making fun of in this, and you could definitely see that in this, because this guy is just, he has no idea what he's doing. He's just a complete moron, and he goes about, and everything he knows about talking to girls about sex is stuff he learns from watching porn.
Yeah, and do you know much about I know obviously in the West we had sort of our sexual revolution in the 70s and that turned a lot of things around. What was that like in Japan? What was this in sort of a fallout of a transitional era in Japanese popular understanding of sex and sexuality?
I mean, you know what? It's because Japan doesn't have the same extent of Christian influence that there is in the West. So there's not really
Mhm.
been like a negative image of sex per se here. So like,
Okay.
um, so I don't think it was like, even back during when before the occupation started, the Japanese government, or the transitioning Japanese government, they put out calls for women to sign up for brothels, to kind of like, sacrifice, because one of the pieces of wartime propaganda was that if the Americans invade, they'll rape everybody in sight, type of thing, which
Mhm.
also the Americans did on their side too. So it was this kind of, both
Yeah, that
sides use these.
classic wartime propaganda.
Right. And so there were these calls for women to volunteer to work at brothels to service the occupation troops, because it was kind of like this idea, like, sacrifice yourself to preserve to soothe the Americans, and preserve I don't know, whatever kind of bullshit it was, and
Mhm.
people did it. And so yeah, and prostitution here was legal until the occupation. And even after the occupation, in the years since, like, prostitution is in this legal gray area. It's semi illegal, like, but there are lots of loopholes in the law, so there's a
Yeah.
lot of that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's this idea that I mean, and obviously, you've got a lot more sexual innuendo stuff, even in like, even in like stuff you'd find in like kids anime and that kind of thing. So it's
Yeah,
not
for
that
sure.
there's a bit more liberation when it comes to sexuality to some extent. I mean, there's still obviously, like, uh gender-based discrimination about it. You know, it's more uh permissive for men as opposed to women, that kind of thing. So you do
Mhm.
still have kind of that kind of idea, like the whore Madonna complex, all that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff still exists, but I don't think it's to the same extent where sex is like this shame thing as it is in the West. So,
Okay.
and if
All right.
anything,
So
there's
that's
been,
not part of it.
no, if anything, I think there's been kind of a reverse of the sexual revolution, just with the the mass extent of all the sexual media that's available, and which has been a big driver for why there's a lot less interest for men and women to be in relationships at all these days. You know, a lot
Mhm.
of so there's that kind of thing too, where there've been a number of articles about how young people are less sexually active than their parents or even their grandparents' generations were.
That's happening in the States to a certain extent too. I think a big part of that we're seeing now is going to be reactions to material conditions
Mhm.
of people not wanting to have kids because everybody's broke, you know.
Very much
But
similar things here. Yeah, very similar ideas here. There's also the workplace discrimination aspect, where women
mhm.
here are basically being told still. I mean, it's not as bad as it was in like the 60s or 70s, but it's still this case where it's like, if you're a woman and you're working somewhere and you get married, the first question your boss starts asking is like, okay, so you're married now, when are you going to start having kids? And then, once you have kids, it's kind of the expectation that you're going to leave your job and you're going to become a housewife. So
Yeah.
so there's that whole aspect of it too. And so a lot of women feel like they have to choose between having a career or having a family. Plus, wages here have been stagnant for like 20 years or something. So yeah,
Mm.
all this stuff definitely factors into the lack of interest in sex. Plus, there is a lot more other outlets for people to get to satisfy themselves. Like, you can watch porn. You can um now they've got these AI girlfriend or boyfriend bots they have everywhere too. So you
Yeah.
can get your rocks off that way. Or you just have, you have like, I don't know, like 10,000, 20,000 yen. You just go to Soapland and get a rub and tug, and that's it. So there's a lot more of this kind of like disposable attitude for sex, as opposed to this idea of sex and relationships and all that.
So you couldn't make a getting any today. This is almost a time capsule of a pre-internet pornography.
No,
Uh,
I think this would still work today, because I think those a lot of those types of things, like the idea of being obsessed with porn and all that kind of stuff. I think that's and getting the wrong attitude about porn. I think all that stuff is still
mhm.
there, right? The sex shops, the hostess bars, the cabaret clubs, which, the latter two are not necessarily selling sex per se, but it's that idea of like that girlfriend image type thing is
Yeah.
still, it's still very big commodities here. So yeah, I think there probably wouldn't have the same. I think maybe they would update some of the cultural references in terms of like
Mhm.
the movies they choose to parody. But other than that, I think it would still fit in with modern Japanese society.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So, audiences, you can still watch this one to this very day, and you'll enjoy it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, most of my familiarity with Japanese society comes from my experiences since moving here, and I came here about 15 years ago. So,
Hmm.
and I still see a lot of parallels in modern Japanese society and the kind of stuff that this movie is making fun of. So, I definitely think it's still pretty relevant today.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't think many young people would get the film references. Is really the whole thing. I think the second half of the film would be lost on a lot of younger Japanese viewers these days.
That's fair. I mean, I think I on a lot of references I didn't get specifically. I think I was
Mhm.
still able to enjoy a lot of it on its own merit, but I do think that the first half being less reference heavy does make it, you know, easier to approach and enjoy.
Yeah, I think they would probably change some of the references. Like, maybe they would have more references to like the more modern Japanese horror movies with like the dark haired ghost types of thing, and those types of
Mhm.
things. Or maybe they'd have references to, instead of like Ghostbusters or stuff like that, they'd probably be referencing like superhero movies or that kind of thing.
Yeah. And to be frank, well, we've all seen Scary Movie. It suffers in the later eras.
Yeah.
It's probably better off that they made this in the mid 90s.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, there's not a whole lot to say about this movie because, like Kitano himself said, this is basically just kind of like him, kind of laughing at stuff that he thinks is funny. But is there any final things you wanted to mention about this movie? Anything that we haven't talked about so far?
Um, Nothing leaps to mind other than, like I say, I do think it's underseen. I think international comedy as a whole tends to be underseen, especially low comedies like this. Like when you think of the type of films that Americans are watching that are from an international market, you're thinking it's going to be either like art house and high drama, or it's going to be genres like action and horror. But comedy so rarely crosses the pond, and I think it's something that people should be checking out and experiencing more of. I think we all it's good always good to feel that we all like to laugh at the same stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's very true, and I think one of the false impressions a lot of people get about Japanese cinema, which is an impression I definitely had before I came here, is that it's all these weird schlock horror films, or it's anime, and you don't
Mhm.
really. And the reason, after coming here and seeing, like, when I told people that one of the reasons I wanted to come to Japan was because I love Japanese movies, they would ask me like, "Oh, well, what Japanese movies do you like?" And I mention like a whole bunch of titles, and of course they know the classics like Kurosawa and that kind of stuff. But when I got into the more modern stuff, they were just kind of like staring at me blankly. They're like, "What are you talking about? I've never heard of this movie before in my life."
Mhm.
And I realized, and that's when I realized that the kind of schlocky stuff that becomes so popular in the West is because people like that because it's so different from the stuff we get in most Hollywood productions. So that's why it gets popular overseas.
Mhm.
Whereas, they're not going to send stuff like these sex comedies from Japan to America because America has its own sex comedies, and they're going to be people are going to understand something like American audiences are going to laugh more, and they're going to get the humor of something like American Pie as opposed
Mhm.
to getting any.
Yeah. This is sort of a bizarre cross between American Pie, the 40-year-old virgin, and Freddy Got Fingered, which
Yeah,
when you accept also with a distinctly Japanese sensibility.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
I think just once again, in terms of just timing, it's just a textbook for the how to time a joke. If you are looking to make any kind of funny movie, any kind of short funny YouTube video, this is something that you could sit and watch, and like this is a textbook.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It shows that, Kitano is still being true to his comedic roots. And I'm not sure if he's done a whole lot of return to that in the years since. Like I said, Zatoichi had a bit of the comedy side in it, but that it was fun to kind of see this side of him because it's not a side that I don't think we see often in a lot of his movies.
No, I think the only other comedic stuff that American audiences would be familiar with would be Takeshi's Castle, but he doesn't do too much there other than watch people get hit with paper mache boulders.
Okay, Chris. So can you tell people where they can find you?
Yes, you can first of all find my podcast. Once again, that's Uncle Monster's Spooky Time Fright Hour, available on all your all your preferred podcast platforms. You can also find me. I'm mostly on Blue Sky these days. You can find me at christhefriend.bsky.social.
Okay, great. And we'll have links to that stuff in the show notes. Please make sure to check that out. As for us, japanonfilm.com is the website. We are Japan on Film on the socials, which these days is pretty much just Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram. And also remember, we are part of the We Made This podcast network. So please make sure to listen after the credits.
Oh, buddy.
Listen after the credits for any to hear what other shows are coming up next on the network. And also, I've got my own comic book that should be available now by the time you are listening to this. It is called Paragons of Earth. If you like superheroes, if you like public domain characters, then check that out. And you can get that at crowdfunder.com /Paragons Comic. That is crowdfunder.com /Paragons Comic. That does it for us. Thanks so much for listening. And I've got to make sure my son goes down for a nap because he is moaning a lot right now. So sorry about that in the background, guys. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the We Made This podcast network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, merchandise, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at JapanOnFilm. If you'd like to help support the show, you can donate at japanonfilm.com, wemadethisnetwork.com, or by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find links with information about each guest and join the discussion on the We Made This Discord in the show notes of each episode. And now, listen to hear what's coming up next on the We Made This Network.
Welcome to Make It So, a Star Trek Legacy podcast. Engage your warp cores and get ready to embark on a thrilling journey through the depths of the 24th and 25th centuries. Have some fun on the Cerritos. Join the Enterprise D crew. Take a trip with Star Trek Voyager. Take some lessons on the Protostar, or even relax on Deep Space Nine. With Make It So, we pay homage to the rich legacy of Star Trek, celebrating its enduring impact on popular culture and its profound influence on science fiction as a whole. We honour the vision of Gene Roddenberry and the countless writers, actors and creators who have brought this incredible universe to life. So join us as we navigate the cosmic expanse of the final frontier, engage in lively discussions, dissecting episodes, analysing characters, and sharing our love for everything Star Trek. Whether you are a lifelong fan or just beginning your voyage, this podcast is for you. It's time to embark on a journey where the stars are our guides, where the impossible becomes possible, and where the spirit of exploration knows no bounds. Welcome aboard Make It So, the Star Trek Legacy podcast that will transport you to new frontiers and ignite your passion for the future. Make it so.
100 years since Nosferatu first terrified audiences on the big screen.
30 years since Francis Ford Coppola gave us Bram Stoker's Dracula.
And 10 years since Dark Shadows with Johnny Depp.
Vampire Videos is a podcast taking a look at this iconic blood-sucking monster on film and television.
I'm Dan Owen.
And I'm Hugh McStay.
And we're here to guide you through a century of vampirism on film. From Hollywood's golden age with Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula,
to the more lurid hammer horrors of the 60s and 70s starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee.
Through to the 80s boom in vampires, which brought these creatures of the night into the modern age.
And everything this century's had to offer us, from foreign and independent films, spoof comedies, and even teenage love stories. Yes, I'm talking about Twilight.
We aim to cover it all, one bite at a time.
So join us on a voyage into the depths of vampire cinema, old and new, with weekly guests offering their own insights and expertise. And why not follow us on Twitter at VampVideos?
A proud part of the We Made This podcast network, subscribe now to Vampire Videos, and thanks for listening.